Hello everyone, StealthyShiroean here, and today I'm bringing you my review of the Humble Choice Bundle for September 2023. A rather big headliner followed up by a decent supporting cast, but there are a few weaker titles in the mix. Definitely not as strong a month as some, but still pretty decent if there's a few here that pique your interest. But as always, let me know what you think of this month's bundle as well in the comments below. Be sure to check the timestamps for specific games, and stay tuned for my final thoughts in the end. Okay, let's get to the review. Starting us off this month is Autonauts vs. Piratebots, which is an automation strategy game, I guess? I'm not exactly sure about that second part, but it definitely is an automation game. I haven't had any experience playing this genre, but what I was exposed to here I actually like. Some of the DNA of this game seems to come from survival crafting games where you need to gather materials in order to make tools, workbenches, and other crafting stations in order to basically make better tools, workbenches, and crafting stations. Presumably more things are unlocked as you play, although I wasn't even able to get through the tutorial during my hour. On that note, I really liked the tutorial. It did enough to hold your hand through what you needed to do, but then also gave players time to breathe and experiment themselves. It was broken up into sections so that when you complete a section, you could then put into practice what was just shown to you, or go off and try to figure out how to play the game yourself. While the graphics or setting might not be that appealing for some, I think the biggest draw to this game is how the automation works with the worker bots. With each bot, you could show them tasks they need to do and it will create a pseudocode script to follow. You could then alter this script for them to have more complicated routines, and it was actually quite fun trying to figure out the appropriate logic for these little guys to follow. This alone would be a driving factor for me to return to this game at some point. Next up is Who Pressed Mute on Uncle Marcus, which is a FMV mystery game. You play as Abby and are contacted by your Uncle Marcus, who explains that he's been poisoned, and to make matters worse, it was one of the family who did it to him. Your job is to find out who might have poisoned him and how by questioning people in the upcoming family quiz. It's an odd setup, but it works for the most part. The acting here was decent, and everyone did a great job to really make themselves unlikable. This really is a horrible family. But it also has humorous elements as well, despite the serious subject matters. My first playthrough ended in about 45 minutes. I was surprised with how quick it was and how little that I uncovered during my time. Luckily though, players aren't expected to learn who the potential killer is in your first playthrough. In fact, I'm not even sure if it's possible. And this is because during each playthrough you get to choose who you team up with for different quiz rounds to uncover as much evidence as possible. From playthrough to playthrough the evidence is persistent, and from there you can make better educated guesses as to who the killer is. Although it does seem that since you're just collecting the evidence until you have enough to make an accusation, that there won't really be much deduction on the player's end, but instead they just need to play enough until they can guess correctly. I'm not really into these types of games myself, and I'm unsure if I'd continue playing to find all the endings, but they do give a helpful skip function after you beat the game once. Foretales is a card game featuring a branching storyline in a medieval fantasy animal world. This was a really interesting take on the card game genre. Many of these, or the ones I played anyways, are just roguelites with card-based battling, with a loose story attached to the gameplay. But in Foretales, the narrative is one of the main pillars of the game. The brief setup entails Volpain, a thief, and his friend Leo, teaming up to take on a heist job to steal a mystical lyre. Upon touching this lyre, Volpain receives visions of terrible things to come. This opens the game up for the players to choose how to tackle different missions in order to change the various potential futures. On top of this, within the card battles themselves there are plenty of narrative elements, such as dialogues with various characters, or the narrator commenting on different things the player chooses to do in the form of selecting different cards to interact with locations or characters. The battles that do take place also favor the use of different consumable resources, and many of them I found myself not even fighting in the conventional sense because it would be too high risk. I liked all these different elements coming together to offer players a sense of choice within the card game mechanics as well as having some level of impact in the story. The game does boast multiple endings, so this seems like it will have replay value, even if it doesn't follow a roguelike trend like some of the other digital card games out there. And while Foretale might not be a roguelite, the next game, Patch Quest, is. Patch Quest is a made-up world of patchwork squares with corresponding patch-looking plants and creatures populating it. The player is an explorer trying to stitch together the world, I guess. I didn't actually do much of that. What I did do in the game was travel around a fixed world as the locations of the world didn't change, so it wasn't completely procedurally generated, but some of the hostile enemies and obstacles could be different. This felt like a bit of a change and allowed for you to be ready for what was to come and know where to go in subsequent runs. As you explore and conquer the challenges along the way, you could open up shortcuts and fast travel points to get back to where you were last time a lot faster. Actually, it seems there might even be some Metroidvania elements in the sense that you might need certain equipment or mounts to get past obstacles, similar to things like a crouch or double jump unlocked in a Metroidvania. And mounts are the real thing that sets Patch Quest apart from other similar games. Mounts pull from the monster taming genre. In each venture into the wilderness, players can lasso a creature, and if they're successful, they can tame it and turn it into a mount that has their own individual abilities. However, they don't last forever and will leave after their stamina reaches 0. It's a brilliant system that offers up fun experimentation, although I did find it funny that my best run was not using any mounts at all because I had an army of follower critters. But that's kind of beside the point. Patch Quest felt like a breath of fresh air for the genre, and despite roguelikes not really being my thing, I definitely want to come back to this at some point. Following up is a narrative card game adventure. Wait, didn't I just talk about this? Huh. Well, I guess we have 2 this month, which for me is really surprising since I just was saying how I never encountered something quite like this before. However, at first glance, Aces and Adventures may not seem to hold up next to Foretales. The overall production value isn't as good, and the storytelling, while it exists in story beats that play between fights, isn't nearly as robust as the choices that can be made in the previously talked about title. That said, Aces and Adventures does have its own charm. A lot of the story and the art reminded me of something out of an 80s fantasy novel for kids to young adults, from the writing to the art. The voice acting is pretty decent, and I enjoyed listening to it even if it did feel a bit disjointed. Gameplay follows some poker rules with how to attack. Matching the same cards or making poker combinations along with the hero's specific skills and buffs determine the amount of damage done to an enemy. The combat plays out over an attack and defense round that repeats until the player wins or they're defeated. There are several classes that of course have their own playstyles, and I assume as you progress in the game and gain more card packs, then you could start building out decks more to the player's preference. And those card packs are earned in-game, by the way. There are no real money purchases here. I can't say I enjoyed it that much playing as the first hero, the warrior, but I really liked the card synergies the rogue had, which was the next class that I unlocked. I think that saved this title for me as something I could eventually see playing again. The Forgotten City is an interesting one. What started as an award-winning mod for Skyrim eventually turned into a fully featured game. Obviously, the developers changed things for their own title since Skyrim wasn't their own IP, but the concept remains similar. The player arrives in a city deep underground and in another time. The really peculiar thing is that it's a city devoid of all sin, because if one were to commit a sin, then the city's citizens would face complete destruction. Players have to find out who's going to be the one to break this golden rule, and if they're unable to, then there's a Groundhog Day mechanic that rewinds time. This allows players to gather more information from others in order to eventually break this cycle and hopefully find their way back into their own time. I never played the original mod, so I have no basis for comparison, but the use of a Roman city and accompanying lore was really immersive and interesting for me. I love the art design they took with the game as well. The characters and story itself felt like it'd be fleshed out, and I think will be fun uncovering each person's secrets in an attempt to piece the mystery together. I think unless you're not a fan of a lot of talking in games or a strong narrative, then this one should be one to try from this bundle. It's been a while since we received something like this. Deceive Inc is a multiplayer-only game, which isn't doing too well if Steam chart numbers are any indication. Surprisingly, this game was released in March of this year, so I imagine this is the developer's push to try and increase the player count. even though that never seems to work any other time a dying multiplayer game has been put in the humble choice. But before this turns into a rant, what exactly is Deceive Inc? Well, it's a game about being spies. Players have to masterfully use gadgets, and more importantly, disguises to juke out their opponents. They need to blend in while gathering intel and infiltrating the different areas in order to steal a MacGuffin, and then extract with it. For anyone looking for some comparison, if you're familiar with the multiplayer mode in the older Assassin's Creed games, then it's very much like this. However, like that mode, Deceive Inc doesn't seem to have attracted very much interest. Which is unfortunate because I think it is a fun game. I'm horrible at it, and I doubt I'd ever get very good, but it definitely was enjoyable. Although, I think the one criticism I have with it is that there's nothing really stopping the game from being a last man standing ordeal. It seemed that instead of sneaking around, many players just let loose on each other to eliminate them. There's no respawning, so once the herd is culled, it's easy to move around without any worry. Obviously, I haven't played enough to know how balanced this is, but first impressions make me feel that it's really broken. If you have some friends, this might be fun to play together, or if you just want to support this game, then give it a go. Hate to say it, but I don't think it will stick around for very long. And finally, the headliner of the month being Tiny Tina's Wonderlands, the Chaotic Great Edition. If you like Borderlands, then you'll be right at home with Tiny Tina's Wonderlands. This game takes place in the Borderlands version of Dungeons & Dragons, known as Bunkers and Badasses. Some fans of the series may remember the DLC for Borderlands 2 that was done in the same vein. Well, now there's a whole game dedicated to this fantasy world. For those hoping that it would really fully lean into the fantasy setting with a wide array of different classes and playstyles, well, don't expect that much. I appreciated some of the changes, but it's ultimately a Borderlands game, just with some slight changes and a new coat of paint. And for some, this shouldn't be a problem. I know that for myself, my wife and I have wanted to play this game for a while now, so we were pretty happy to see it in the bundle. But for others, I definitely understand if you're a bit burned out of Borderlands. From what I can say, it does have that signature Borderlands humor, for better or worse. I think the writing is better than Borderlands 3 from what little I played of that one, but once again, it is the same Borderlands, so don't expect the fantasy setting to change much of anything for you if you didn't like the core foundation of the main title games. Personally, I can't wait to come back, and I don't think you could go wrong with their co-op formula, so for me, I definitely am going to be playing more of this. Okay, let's wrap this up and see if this bundle is worth it or not. I based my rating solely on whether I thought the game was worth playing on about an hour or so of hands-on gameplay. Also, I'd be grateful if you could please give the video a like if you're enjoying it, because that really helps me out with the YouTube algorithm gods. Overall, this month wasn't bad, but it definitely falls in as one of the weaker months of 2023. Tiny Tina's Wonderlands does a lot to hold the bundle up, but if Borderlands isn't your thing, then I think a lot of it crumbles apart after that. There were quite a few weaker titles, and even something like The Forgotten City isn't going to be enough to carry this month on its own. But, as always, everyone's mileage will vary. So, without further ado, let's get into the recommendations, starting with the must-plays of the month. In this spot, we have The Forgotten City and Tiny Tina's Wonderlands. The Forgotten City had a strong narrative focus with a very interesting setting and world building. Extra brownie points for using Roman history and culture for the basis of the game. Tiny Tina's Wonderlands just scrapes by into this spot, with the caveat being if you're playing this with a friend. I'll have a ton of fun playing this with my wife, but if you're tired of the Borderlands formula, the fantasy setting probably isn't going to be enough to change your mind if you're just going in solo. In the strong recommendations, we have Patch Quest and Foretales. Patch Quest is a really unique game blending a bunch of different genres together that makes for some interesting gameplay. Foretales focuses on branching narrative, and blending it with the card game mechanics was also an interesting design choice, putting it up here in this spot. Lastly, in our week recommendations, there are the remains of the bundle, being Aces and Adventures, Who Pressed Mute on Uncle Marcus, Autonauts vs. Piratebots, and Deceive Inc. In contrast to the aforementioned Foretales, Aces and Adventures is similar in several ways, but I place this one in the week recommendations because if it came down to choosing either one from the bundle, then I'd rather play Foretales for the stronger emphasis on narrative, and I personally like Foretales' art better as well. That said, Aces and Adventures is a good game in its own right. Who Pressed Mute on Uncle Marcus is another game that I thought was decent, but being a FMV, I just know that I'm probably not going to come back to it. There's just something about using live action in a video game with minimalistic gameplay that I'm just not a fan of. Autonauts vs. Piratebots seemed to be a decent automation game, but with very little knowledge on that subgenre, I'm really unsure. I enjoyed it enough to place it as a recommendation, but not enough that I would return to it anytime soon. And lastly, Deceive Inc. really did feel like a fun game, but it's on its last legs as a multiplayer-only title. Maybe that's a self-fulfilling prophecy by saying that, but I feel like we've all seen this happen so many times before. And that wraps up my thoughts on this month's bundle. Definitely one of the weaker months this year to date. Do you agree with my thoughts? What games, if any, are you looking forward to playing? Let me know what your thoughts are, or if there are any different recommendations you'd make in the comments below. I hope this video helped you in some small way, and if it did, then please consider leaving a like, comment, subscribe, or whatever it is you feel like doing. Thanks for watching, and have a nice day.